Hey everyone, welcome to Get More Ministries, where we want to help you know God more, love God more, and experience God more. My name is Daryl, and this is a deep dive video into the first paragraph of the Gospel of John. One of my classes for seminary has us translating through portions of this book, and it's really reinforced the idea to me that every English translation you've ever read of the Bible is first an interpretation of the underlying original language. And so what I want to do in this video is kind of give you a peek behind the curtain into how academics really examine the text at a deep level, and we are looking at the language of the text, because what is said determines what is meant, and the meaning informs our theology, and the theology informs our faith and practice. And we really want to understand, okay, what is John saying? What isn't he saying? And then what does that mean? So let me share my screen and we will get right into it. We're going to be looking at John 1:1 and John 1:5 particularly. Okay, here we go. I have my Logos Bible software up. If you can see where my cursor is and where I'm highlighting the text here in kind of this left-hand upper part of the screen, that's where we're going to be living for most of this. We are also going to move over to this right-hand pane, and I'll try to make this a little bit bigger at some point. But that's really where the screen is, that's where the action is going to be. Right now I have the Tyndale House Greek New Testament open to Evangelion Kata Ioannein, which is the Gospel of John. This is chapter 1, verse 1. And we are going to be looking at this first paragraph, John 1:1 and 1:5. Let's go ahead and get started. We have John 1:1 here. And so I'm going to do some like reading in Greek and also translation on the fly, that kind of stuff. But we have NRK hein halagas. So in the beginning, right, was the Word. Kai halagas hein prostantheon. And the Word was with God. Kai theos hein halagas. And the Word was God. Okay, so this is kind of interesting. Typically, John 1:1 is translated pretty consistently across the board. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God, right? It's very poetic. We really like that. But what's interesting is down here, this, and the Word was God. You can see here that we have kai theos hein halogos. So the subject is halogos, and that is the word, right? But that's the last word in the phrase. That's because in biblical Greek, the word order isn't as important as it is in English. We like subject, verb, object. In Greek, it was oftentimes, like direct object, subject, or direct object, verb, subject, right, adjective. Like it can kind of be all over the place. There's a general method to the madness, but it's also not super important. But because what's really important here is we have two words. We have logos, which on its own could be the subject of the sentence, right? But so could theos, which is God. They're both in what's called the nominative case. So every Greek noun has a case in it. It could be nominative, it could be genitive, dative, or accusative, or it could be vocative. The nominative is typically the subject of the sentence. Well, we have two nominatives. What's going on? Right. But this little word right here, this ha, right, this single little letter, is really important, because that's what's called the definite article. And the definite article makes logos definite. And when you have two nominatives in a sentence or a phrase like that, and one of them has the article and the other one doesn't, the one that has the article is the subject. And so that's how we know which one is doing the verb, right? So the verb here is hein, and that's we translate that as was, right? So the verb to be, but it's a past tense, so it's was. So we want to figure out which one of these two nominatives is wasing. That's what we need to figure out. This definite article, tells us that it's the logos that is doing the wasing, and that the logos was God. right? So that's how we know, and God, it's not. This is how we know it's not, and God was the Word. This is really important um, because there are a couple of reasons why this little phrase is super important. First of all, if theos was the subject, as in theos is doing the wasing, and theos is the Greek word for God, right? Like theology, the study of God, theos. Um, then what we would be saying is God was the Word. So verse 1 would be, hey, the Word was, in the beginning was the Word, and this Word was God, and God was the Word. And now you would have this kind of overlap between God and the Word that is both the same thing and not distinguished. Like the two are not distinguished from one another. And that's actually a pretty big problem. This was a huge doctrinal issue in the early church. And there was a guy called Sabellius, who we have this heretical teaching named after him called Sabellianism, where he was saying, well, no, it's like there's one God and there's really one person of God, but he's like putting on different hats. So at one point he's the Father, and at one point he's the Word, and at one point he's the Spirit, or it's all the same person rather. And but then, like, to whom is Jesus praying? And how can the Father be sending the Son, and the Son be sending the Spirit? And how can the Word be with God if they're the same thing, right? So there's an issue here, right? And so that's why understanding grammar in the original language is really important. Like when we sit down and do word studies, right? If you're an English only person, meaning that you only know English, first of all, like, that doesn't mean you're wrong, and that doesn't mean you're bad at Bible study. So I want to say that right off the bat. But if you're an English only person, it would be very easy to not know what you don't know, right? Like you don't know what you don't know. And so you don't know that there's a very significant grammatical construction going on here. And so you might just look up the word and be like, oh, well, what is theos? Well, it's God. Oh, and it's just, you don't know the parameters that are around this phrase. And so that's why learning grammar and syntax and how a Greek thinker, or like a Greek speaker and writer thought, because we think in our languages before we speak them, that's why it's really important. Because we can see here, logos is the subject because it's definite. Now, there's another argument that you might hear. Well, okay, so logos is the one doing the wasing, right? He's the subject, but he's not the same God as, like, God. Like he's not, like, he's a different God. He's a God, and the argument goes, well, because theos doesn't have an article, that means theos is what we would call indefinite, meaning, so the difference between definite and indefinite. So like, let's say I got a pencil here, right? I can hold a pencil. So I could say this is a pencil, right? That is indefinite. It's one of however many pencils there are, right? It's not a specific pencil, it's a pencil. But if I were to say this is the pencil that I use with my homework, now all of a sudden I am narrowing the field of possible pencils, and I'm saying, no, this is the one that stands out as the one that I use for my homework, as opposed to all the other pencils, right? So definite, like the word the, makes this pencil distinct and definite, whereas if we don't use it, it could, and if I say this is a pencil, then it's indefinite and it's one of pencils. So the argument here is that because theos does not have a definite article, it must be indefinite. And that's also not true according to Greek grammar. This is what we call, theos here is another grammatical construction. We call this a predicate nominative. And obviously, like, I don't expect you to know all these grammatical structures, but it's difficult to talk about what we're talking about without using categories. And that's what lingo gives us. It gives us categories. So It's what's called a predicate nominative. And the predicate nominative is, again, a specific structure that informs the reader of, oh, okay, these two things are the same and they go together. And so while this structure doesn't require theos to be definite, the predicate nominative doesn't require it to be definite, it also means that it doesn't have to be indefinite. Now you could say, well, no, okay, no, we're just like choosing whichever one we prefer. But again, word order is malleable in Greek. And writers can bring a word to the front of a clause or a phrase or a sentence in order to bring emphasis and meaning. Okay? So John could have said, Kai halagos ein theos, right? Like, he could have said that and put the subject towards the front. But instead, he brings theos to the front, and it's called fronting for emphasis. So he's emphasizing the godness, right, of logos. So now, I want to read just one summary on kind of how this makes sense. Because I know that this is really in the weeds, but it's important because this is the difference between saying Jesus is God, the same essence, the same being as God the Father, different persons, but the same being, right? This is the difference between Trinitarian theology and saying Jesus is a God, or Jesus is a divine being, possibly a created being, right? That's what we're dealing with. That's why this is so important. So down here, I'm not going to make it bigger, I'll just read it, but down here, if you can see where I've got it highlighted, this is where we're reading from. So Wallace, Dan Wallace, that's referring to Dan Wallace, he is a New Testament scholar. So Wallace's own proposal that the most likely candidate for theos is qualitative, expressing the divine essence of the Word, the Logos, while distinguishing him from the person of the Father. This seems to me quite plausible because it is consistent with Jesus' claim in the fourth gospel, the Gospel of John, that he and the Father are one, yet distinct from one another. Okay, so this is getting at this, when we say like qualitative, we're talking the quality of something. So, if you think quantity is number of things, quality is kind of like that intrinsicness to the thing. So it's saying by fronting theos and using the construction where halogos is being equated in some way to theos, he's saying this is giving the divine quality, the divine essence to halogos. Okay, that's a big deal because he's claiming that. Let's look at earlier in verse 1. In the beginning was the Word. Now, this clearly harkens us back to Genesis 1:1, right? In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. So he's giving this like, in the beginning, before creation, like we're supposed to be drawn back to that idea. So in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. So the Word was with God in the beginning. Now, John continues to move on here in verse 2, hutas ein en arche prostantean. This one was in the beginning with God, right? So he's just kind of reiterating that last part of verse 1. And then, panta diautu ageneta, kai koris autu ageneta, ude hen ha geganen. So all things through him were created. All things were created through him. And apart from him, right, without him, nothing was made that has been made. So he's clearly associating that Logos is in the beginning with God before creation, because everything's created through him. everything that's created, not one thing that's been created, was created apart from him. Well, if the Logos himself were created because he's something other than God, how could his own creation go through him? Like, if you're an agent of creation, you have to predate that which is created. And so I know that's a loaded topic. There's a lot there, and maybe your brain hurts, but that's what's going on, okay? So this little phrase, it's incredibly important theologically, and the way that it's written is also important, because it's on the surface, without knowing the grammar and syntax, you could say, oh, well, he's saying this. It's like, well, but he's not saying that, because there are rules to grammar, right? We, like English, we like subject, verb, object. If we break that, sometimes you can still tell what we are referring to, right? So like we can hear Yoda talk in Star Wars, and you can piece it together, and it's fun and it's good. But it's like, but Yoda grammatically is difficult to understand. You're like, wait, what is he saying? Because we like subject, word, object. We're very dependent on word order. But Greek isn't. But Greek can front things and move them around in order to create emphasis, all the while still making a this equals that type of concept. So that's kind of the first thing that we see right off the bat here in verse 1. Also, the other reason, but again, the grammar alone, while that's valuable, it's also verses 2 and 3 that reinforce that grammatical rule. Because we say, okay, the Logos is an active agent of creation. Well, then he predates creation. And if everything that was created through him, then that can't include himself. Like, he can't be created. He has to be self-existent. So it's really important. But all of those, so when we sit down and we study, and especially when we want to sit down, we want to start studying words and phrases and that kind of stuff. One, we want to understand as best we can, to the best of our ability, right, what's going on behind the scenes. Is there some type of grammatical or syntactical structure that is, focusing us in a certain direction? Secondly, we also want to use, okay, so this is what I think is going on here, but what do the surrounding verses say? Because words get kind of the most, their meaning is brought to light by how they're used in relation to the words around them and the concepts around them. So as we continue to move through verses 2 and 3, we see, okay, yeah, this predicate nominative, this fronting, these things, this qualitative concept, this makes a lot of sense based on verses 2 and 3. Okay, so now we're going to move down and look at verses 4 through 5. We're going to mostly look at 5 because I want to touch on another linguistic thing, and that is when we sit down to do an actual word study, and we're going to look that word up. So enalto zoein, so in him was life. Kai zoe ein taphos ton anthropon, and the life was the light of humanity or mankind. Kai taphos entes katia fine, and the light in the darkness shines. So the light shines in the darkness. Kai hes katia alta u katalaben, and the darkness, it not, and then this is the word that we're going to analyze, katalaben. This is a lot of fun. When we get to a word and we want to better understand it, and we want to not only get a definition, but get into the thought. So I don't know if you can see right now, but as I have my cursor over it, there's like a bar. There's like a a line of text, and you can see it moving here a little bit. It's right in the center of the screen, and it's got the verb, and it gives us the parsing information, and then down at the very end it says like to overcome, to grasp, to comprehend. And you think, oh, well, that's what it means. Well, okay, I want to give you a difference between a gloss, like a word's gloss, and a word's definition, and a word's semantic range, because those are three terms you might not have heard about, but they're really important. So a gloss comes down to, these are the very basic, most likely probable concept or base definition that's at play here right now. That is not the robust definition of the word. That is the gloss. Okay, so when we look here, and I bring up kind of the instant details of this word, it gives me some glosses. That's not the end-all be-all of what this word means. Next, we have a definition, which is a more robust version of the gloss. So it's going to give some explanation behind kind of the concepts of the gloss. Then we have the semantic range. And the semantic range refers to everything, all the possible definitions that word could mean in any given context. Because words don't have just a singular meaning, like, well, this word means this and this word means that. And it's like words have a range of meaning, that any one of those meanings could be called upon in any given moment. Okay. Off the top of my head, the only English word that I know of that has the same meaning every time is the word I, the first person personal pronoun referring to the speaker or the writer. When I use the word I'm referring to me. When you use the word I, you are not referring to me. You're referring to yourself, right? But when I use the word I, like, I don't use that in reference to you. Like, you know what I mean? So I is possibly the only word that I can think of in English that has one meaning kind of across the board. Doesn't really mean anything else. Every other word has at least one other possible meaning. Take the word you, for example. Could mean singular or plural. So if I say, if I use the word you in any given context would have to determine, am I referring to a you singular, or am I referring to all y'all, right? You plural. And so when we study words, there are really three things that we want to be aware of. We want to be aware of the definition. We want to be aware of the grammatical and syntactic way that word is used in that context. And we want to be aware of kind of the historical usage of that word. And so that's what we're going to look at now for katalaben. Let me make sure. Yeah. Okay, so I've got that word pulled up over here on the very far right. So now we're going to be looking over here where I've got the screen highlighted and it's kind of jumping up and down a little bit. These are my Greek English lexicons. I have 3 of them open. Lexicon is that means dictionary, but that is the term that we use for dictionaries. So here on the left, I have 1 lexicon open. This one really is dealing more with classical Greek. So if we're talking like Homer, that kind of stuff, those classic ancient authors. This one here kind of works in conjunction with the one on the far left. This is a patristic Greek lexicon, and these two lexicons that I have on the left-hand side, they are kind of designed to work together. And then the main one that I use for seminary and New Testament studies is over here on the far right, and that is, we call it BDAG. Bauer, Danker, Arndt, and Gingrich are the editors, and that is kind of the de facto lexicon for New Testament and early Christian literature studies. It's very heavy-hitting, it's very thorough, and it's the one that we typically use. It has a ton of abbreviations everywhere, and so if you want to start using this lexicon, you got to read what the abbreviations are in the front of the lexicon first, so otherwise it's actually going to be pretty difficult to piece together what they're saying. So I have logos set up to when I triple click on a word, it pulls up the word in the dictionary, in the lexicon. So you can see, boom, I triple click on that, pulls it up. Now, here we're going to distinguish gloss, definition, and semantic range. So as I scroll down, right, we see this 1 that's circled, right? Okay, so that's entry number 1. And that says to make something one's own, to win or attain. Now, that would be a very interesting definition, right? The light shines in the darkness, but the darkness has not made it its own, or has not won it over, right? Okay, that's interesting. So that's a possible definition. And as we keep scrolling down, we can see, we're going to eventually, yep, now we get to circle number 2. So there's another possible definition. To gain control of someone through pursuit, to catch up with, to seize. And we can see now there's a circled A. So now what this tells me is entry number 2 has more than one nuanced way it's used. We have a 2A and we have a 2B. Okay, so now you can see we're starting to see this semantic range open up. So 2A is of authority figures, to catch up with or overtake, and then 2B is mostly of varieties of evil, to seize with hostile intent. You're like, whoa, okay. So 2A might be like, let's see, do I have any of these? Okay, so here's a good example of 2A with the authority figure. This is in Judges, Judges 18:22. So this Greek word is used in the Greek translation of the Old Testament in Judges. And so this is just to give you an example of how this is used. When they had gone a distance from the home of Micah, the men who were in the houses near Micah's house were called out, and they overtook the people of Dan. So you can see there's a pursuit, people caught up. Okay, so that's 2A, but 2B is mostly of varieties of evil. Let's see, do they have something other than our target passage? Okay, so let's go, now again, we're going to go to the Old Testament, Genesis 19:19. So this is Lot after the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, right? The destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah. So Lot is speaking. He says, "Behold, your servant has found favor in your sight, and you have shown me great kindness in saving my life. But I cannot escape to the hills, lest the disaster overtake me and I die." So we can see there's an overtakingness, but it kind of, the one who's doing the overtaking is different in 2A versus 2B. In 2A, it's humans, like authority people, that kind of stuff. In 2B, it's like a situation. So this is where Sodom and Gomorrah are taken out, and Lot is commenting on the action of them being taken out and how it might catch up with him and take him out. So that's what's going on. So you can see here we have, not only do we have multiple definitions, we have circle number 1, we have circle number 2, but even within definitions, these semantic ranges can be kind of more particularly defined, and we see more and more nuance. Then we have 2C, especially used of night, evening, darkness coming upon a person. So, like, you know, I'm swallowed up by the night, or night is catching up to me, the darkness is catching up to me, that kind of stuff. Then we have circle number 3, to come upon someone with implication of surprise or to catch, right? And again, 3A, so of moral authorities, to catch or detect. And then 3B is of a thief, right? So we can see the moral is more like abstract, but the thief is an actual person, right? So again, there's a catching up thing that's being described, and that which is catching up could be abstract, it could be moral, or it could be a thief, right? Then we get down to number 4, circle 4, and again there's an A, which means there's going to be a B. So circle 4 is to process information, understand, or grasp. So that's to like comprehend, to understand something, right? So 4A is to learn about something through the process of inquiry, grasp. So and then in the middle voice, that's a Greek verb thing. There's active, middle, passive voices. That means to grasp or find or understand. And then, let's see, we're in 4. 4B, we have, 4B just says on John 1:5, C1 and 2 above. Okay, cool. So that's semantic range. Okay, and you can see that's a lot more developed than simply when I hovered over katalaban in the text, and we have this, again, it's moving up and down a little bit on the screen, but we have this gloss that just says to overcome, to grasp, or comprehend. So you can see the lexicon has provided me a much more full and complete understanding of the possible ways a writer could leverage this word. And some of them have pretty fine nuance to them, right? Like, hey, here's an overarching category. It can be abstract. It can be not abstract, right? So it's important when we're doing word studies that we don't just look up the first entry and say, oh, well, that's what the word means, and then apply that to our text. Because really what you're doing is you're projecting a possible definition into a scenario that may or may not be correct. And now we're going to work through, now I'm going to show you how do we work through and figure out, okay, well, which one is correct for katalaban in John 1:5. This is where it gets fun. Okay, so I don't know if you noticed, but I have it, so not only do I have it that when I triple click in Logos, it pulls up my preferred lexicons, but I also have it set to where the verse that I clicked from is highlighted in the lexicon if the lexicon cites that verse in the definition. So you can see here, we have a hit here in entry number 1. We have another hit in entry number 1. And then, let's see, now we're in nothing in 2A. We have a hit in 2B. And nothing in 2C. Let's see, in 3A, nothing. 3B, nothing. 4A is nothing. And 4B, we have a hit. Okay, now, as we just walked through, all of those definitions are slightly different from one another. And the fact that we have a hit in each one of them tells us that BDAG, the editors of BDAG, are not 100% confident of, hey, 100% without a shadow of a doubt, this word means this here. Like, there's no doubt about it, right? You can see they're like, well, could be this. Also could be this. Oh, also it might be this. So, 2 rules for when you look up words in lexicons. Number 1, don't just go to the first definition and project that into your text. That's an interpretive fallacy. Don't do that. Rule number 2, don't scan the text for the first occurrence of your passage that they cite. And then just say, oh, well, there's my passage. There's John 1:5. It's in entry number 1. Entry number 1 says to make something one's own, to win or attain. Boom, ipso facto, that's my definition. We also can't say that because if we had just been a little bit more patient, right, we scroll down and we hit 2B, and then you're like, wait, but is it this? Right? So now we have to do what's called the interpretive work. Now we have to slog through the semantic range in order to narrow our definition. So notice how I said that. I said we have to slog through the semantic range in order to find the correct or most likely definition. Again, semantic range is all the possible definitions, and then the actual definition for our passages, after slogging through it, this is the one that we feel is most appropriate for this definition. All right, so here we go. Circle number 1, entry number 1, to make something one's own, to win or attain. This is an interesting concept, and you're not going to see many English translations go with this option, but there are some things about this option that I really like. Okay, as you can see, I've already highlighted some of this. So the passive of this verb is found in the meaning make one's own in the ending of Mark in the freer manuscript. And then it says, this may also be the meaning of katalaban in John 1:5. So what the editors are doing here is they're looking at how this word is used elsewhere in Mark, and they're like, this could be how it's used here. Like, there's enough grammatical and syntactical information and specifically as you like would get further in John's gospel, to possibly support this as a definition. Now, you aren't going to see many, I'm not sure if I've seen any English translations say, and the darkness did not win it over, right? I don't know that I've seen that. And so that gives me pause, right? Like, okay, well, obviously a lot of editing committees, like the NIV, the ESV, like these editing committees haven't gone that route. So maybe that gives me pause, right? But for theological reasons, I like this definition. I'm not committing to it at this point, right? But I like it because it communicates a certain type of conflict between the light and the darkness that we'll talk about here in a minute. Moving down, we're still in entry number 1. And it's C. Wetstein on John 1:5 and 2b below. The darkness did not grasp it. So there we get, the action includes kind of this active grasping at something and kind of reaching out for it. And you'll see this translation from time to time in English. Let's see, in which case grasp easily passes over to the sense of comprehend. Okay, so here, and now we've qualified the word grasp, right? Because grasping could have multiple uses. And you can see I was like, oh, it means like kind of reaching out and grabbing it. Well, actually, they're saying like, in which case it means kind of more comprehend. Oh, okay. Well, that's good. That's helpful because, again, grasp has a semantic range. And the way I thought of it is first to like reach out and grab something. But they're saying like, yeah, it's more of like grasping an idea, right? Like you comprehend it. And so that's interesting. Now we're still in entry number 1. Most Greek commentators since Origen is an early church father. Most Greek commentators since Origen take katalaben here as overcome or suppress. So that's different. Okay, overcoming or suppressing is different than grasping or comprehending. Each one of those, grasping and comprehending, overcoming and suppressing, brings up 2 different types of conflict. Okay, brings up 2 different types of conflict. And depending on which way you define katalaben, like you're going to define katalaben whichever way you see the conflict being described. So if you think the conflict is one way, you're going to define it as grasp, comprehend. If you think the conflict is another way, you're going to define it suppress or overcome. And we're going to keep working our way through that. But perhaps John intended to include both meanings. And some such translations, master would suggest this. So when we see, and the darkness did not master it, they're choosing to say, okay, I see both a comprehension and an overcoming suppression. And that's very appealing because kind of using a word in 2 ways simultaneously is very much within John's writing style. This is something that I very, very, very much love about John. He's probably my favorite theological thinker in the New Testament because when you read John and you study him and you say, okay, you're saying this, and then you come back and you read it again and you read it again and you read it again and you're studying and you're meditating, you're recognizing, okay, you are saying that, but you're also saying more than that. You're also saying this over here. And I think we're supposed to see both of them simultaneously. So this is very much appealing to say both are likely intended. Now let's keep going. So 2b, right? So entry number 2, to gain control of someone through pursuit to catch up with. Remember, this is the one that like we read the 2 Old Testament references. The first one was an authority figure catching up to someone. That's not our use here. The one that we're using is kind of that abstract, like evil catching up with you. And so you can see like John 1:5 is in the discussion on this possible definition. And that's mostly varieties of evil seized with hostile intent, overtake, or come upon. So that's more of like the darkness actively engaging in a hostile way, right? Catching up with, actively engaging, combating. That's interesting. And now we've got to go down. Right, and the only last one is entry 4B, but that just redirects us back up to number 1 and 2. Okay, so what does that tell us about our possible definitions for katalaban? Well, really, it tells us there's obviously a contrast and a conflict going on here, and we can see that like the tafos, the light, shines in the darkness, but the darkness does not master it, overcome it, whatever. Well, in order to kind of narrow this further, right? Because if I'm being honest, if I go ahead and define katalaban now, I'm kind of just choosing which definition here I prefer, or which one I think sounds better. And that's not really what we want to do, because there's another step here that we want to go through and say, okay, I've surveyed the semantic range, I've surveyed the possible definitions, I'm noticing that it's coming down to a contrast, and that there's some kind of opposition, there's some kind of contention going on. But I don't know exactly which one is most important. Now, I could just say, well, I think it's both. Okay. But we kind of want to understand, why is it both? And in order to understand that, we need to look closer at the words around our target word. So our target word is katalaban. Now we want to look at some of the words around it that kind of help frame this understanding. And the one that we're going to do is heiskatia, which is the darkness. Because the darkness is the subject of katalaban, right? The darkness is the one doing the katalaban-ing, right? It's the one doing that action, because it's the subject. So now we want to look at skatia. Now, we're not going to go through the whole lexicon process of skatia again. I'm going to kind of summarize that. There are really 3 interpretive options that we could have here. Number 1, we could interpret skatia in a creation context. So we obviously have creation of the cosmos at play here, right? In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. This brings us right back to Genesis 1:1. We've already talked about that, right? That is one of, like, if we're sure of, like, anything in John's Gospel, in the opening lines of John's Gospel, in John 1:1 and through 5, it's like John's bringing us back to creation, right? Okay. So because that's already at play here in this paragraph, that has some weight to it. That has some merit. You're like, okay, well, what was going on in creation? Well, God separated the light from the darkness, right? And the light he called day, the darkness he called night, and like the light like invaded and shone into the darkness, and we have the separation. So that could be what's going on here, right? Like the darkness, or the light shines in the darkness, right? Kaitafos ente skatia fine. The light shines in the darkness. Well, that has a lot of imagery from creation in Genesis 1:1 and following. You're like, okay, so I can see that. That's a viable possibility. The downside with that one is it's like, to me, that doesn't make the most sense of katalaban, because it's like, okay, so like, what, like, to me, on the surface of it, there's deeper study that we could do. On the surface of it, it's like, how is there that contrast there, right? And again, we'd have to go back and study Genesis 1:1 to kind of dig further into that. But that's a question, like, is that explanation the best explanation for what John is saying here, and how he's going to continue talking about light and darkness in his gospel? Option number 2 is that heiskatia, the darkness, is referring to kind of the inner state of understanding of humanity. Okay? So let's bounce back up to verse 4. In him, in the Logos, life was life, right? So in him was life. And the life was the light of mankind, or humanity. So here we have a clear, him is referring back to the Logos, and we have this association, like, in him is this life, and that life is the light of man. And it is the light, kaitafos, right? That's the light that's shining in the darkness. And the darkness does not katalaben it. Okay, well now this has some merit, right? We have this idea of there's this life of man, and that's what's shining. Okay, and this gets into a theme throughout John's gospel of like people not understanding, but Jesus like giving the understanding. So we see this a little bit at play in John 2 with the cleansing of the temple, and they ask him like this temple is taken 46 years to build, and you're going to build it. You're going to rebuild it in 3 days, and he's clearly talking about something other than what they think he's talking about. We see it very much at play with Nicodemus, where Nicodemus is saying, "Well, but born again? How could someone be born again? Can he enter his mother's womb a second time and be born after he's been old? Right? Like what are you talking about?" We see it with the woman at the well in John 4, where she's like, yeah, give me this water always so that I don't have to come back and draw it. And Jesus is like, no, I'm not talking about water from that well. I'm talking about a living water that's abstract, that's spiritual, right? He's talking in different ways. And so that makes a lot of sense with John's gospel, where we have kind of this light theme. Jesus says, I'm the light of the world. We have a light and darkness theme, and we have this idea kind of presented here and elsewhere of like what we would call inner illumination. So when Jesus is talking with Nicodemus, there's a difference between revelation and illumination. And people usually only use, like people in the church, like your average Christian, they will use revelation for both things, and it creates a lot of confusion. So revelation is like referring to like God like delivering like the content of a message to you type of thing. Illumination refers to your comprehension and understanding of that message. So in John 3, Jesus is like speaking to Nicodemus. We could call that the revelation. Like he's revealing to Nicodemus, hey, you got to be born again. Nicodemus does not have an illuminated understanding of what that means because he's not comprehending it, right? We see it in John chapter 2, where like people, like the disciples are witnessing Jesus doing the wedding at Cana and then the cleansing of the temple. And it's like after these things, like after Jesus is resurrected, now they receive the full understanding of what that means according to the Old Testament scriptures, right? But the Spirit brought the illumination. They were illumined to what that means. So here, Scatia would be talking about like the darkness is the unillumined mind, and the light is shining into that, and the lack of understanding is not comprehending the light, right? So if we were to take Scatia as referring to like the inner, like the state of illumination within somebody, whether or not they understand what the content of the revelation means, then we're going to interpret katalaben as grasping / comprehending. And I keep doing this for grasping, even though it's more of an abstract thing. We're going to interpret katalaben based on our interpretation of Heskatia. So if we think that Heskatia refers to that inner status of illumination, this like whether or not you're in an illumined state, then if you think then you're going to say, well, the darkness, the unillumined state did not comprehend, the light. So that gives you an illustration of how, when we're on the fence about a word, this is when we want to slow down. We don't want to be hasty with word studies. So like when it comes to word studies, you want to be like Treebeard from Lord of the Rings. Don't be hasty, Master Meriadoc, right? Like, don't be hasty. You want to slow down. You want to think. If you aren't positive in the moment, you shelve it. You come back to it. You shelve it. You come back to it. You keep researching. You keep thinking. You keep meditating. All of those things. Because in this situation, our understanding of one word is really heavily determined by our understanding of another one. Okay, so our first possible definition of Heskatia is that creation theme, right? The light and dark of creation. Our second possible interpretation of Heskatia, the darkness, is the kind of state of illumination within humanity. And that's really playing on verse 4 here, verse 4 and 5a. 5a refers to the first half of 5. And then the third possible option is you would take Skatia to be like the forces of darkness kind of thing. So now you're thinking of darkness more of in that evil sense, like the abstract like evil category, but we're thinking of it as like the entities of evil. So we're not thinking of it as like the like evil circumstances of like, oh, maybe like a natural disaster or something like that. We're not necessarily thinking of it like that, but we're thinking of it, okay, the forces of darkness did not, most likely they did not overcome him. Or this brings us back to entry number 1. Remember that first entry that I said, I like this theologically, but I'm not sure it's the best use here in John? That's the one to make one's own, right? To like win one over, to make one's own, right? So then like the forces of darkness did not win him over. Now, I've never seen anybody translate it that way, which gives me pause into saying that this is the preferred definition. But it's interesting theologically, but I'm not sure it's correct for John's usage of it. Let me explain. We've already kind of established that the definition or meaning of one word really depends on the words around it, right? And in this case, if the temptation of Jesus began in verse 6 here, right? Like, I'm going to be much more likely to be persuaded that this is the forces of darkness. Why? Because when we look at the temptation of Jesus, we and that's in Matthew and Luke, okay? When we look at the temptation of Jesus, Satan is obviously trying to get Jesus to like pledge his allegiance to Satan, to turn his back on God, to kind of win him over to his side. And so there's a lot of like theologically rich material there. The problem is John does not record the temptation of Jesus. It's not in the Gospel of John. Okay, well, that's kind of like the main like evidence that would support this, in my opinion, but that's not in John. We do have in 1 John 3, 1 John 3:8, like the reason the Son of God came was to destroy the works of the devil. So we definitely see a conflict there, combating one another. But again, that's outside of this book. Most likely the same writer. I think it's the same writer, but not in this book. So it's very far removed from our passage. That decreases the likelihood of it being that meaning. But some of the themes that we do have in John are like witness, testimony. John's gospel, like the entire thing, is a giant witness. And like the gospel as a whole is a giant witness. John tells us this. The purpose he wrote his gospel is given to us in John chapter 20, verses 30 and 31. Jesus said and did many other things that are not recorded in this gospel, but these are recorded and included so that you may believe that Jesus is the Son of God, right? It's like, okay, boom, that's the purpose statement for this gospel. So everything that John includes is to testify to who Jesus is. Then we get down even later, even right here in verse 6, ageneta anthropos apostamenos, paratheu. There was a man sent from God named John, Anamato Ioannis, whose name was John, right? This one came to testify, to bear witness about the light, right? So that all might believe through him, right? All might believe through him. He himself was not the light, but he bore witness, or he testified about the light. So here we have this testimony theme right on the heels of our right, conflict passage of our passage we're trying to understand. Okay, well, that really speaks a lot to that inner illumination interpretation, right? That really speaks to, like, okay, he's testifying, he wants people to believe, he's trying to bear witness, all of that. That gives to allowing people to understand something with their mind, to get them from a state of not understanding to understanding, right? We have movement there. That's, that's very persuasive in this sense. So, to me, when we survey this, our understanding of katelaben and what it means to, like, either overcome or grasp or understand is really depending on our understanding of darkness. And our understanding of darkness itself kind of depends on the themes and words around it. And so in this case, I think the kind of the first conclusion that we should arrive at is there's probably like an inner understanding theme going on here. But John is also a master of loading words and phrases with more than one meaning. And so I think there is, as we saw back here in entry number 1, where it was like there's this kind of dual meaning of mastering it, right? That's also very persuasive, because I don't know that Heiskatia and Katelaben are functioning exclusively as inner illumination. Like, it means inner illumination to the exclusion of the other possible definitions. I don't know that. And the reason why I don't know that is because of how John writes. And so, like, moving forward, it's one of those things where I'm going to hold a dual meaning here. And I'm going to bring that possibility with me in the future as I continue to study this verse. Because now, when I return, like, if I were to say, and the darkness has not mastered the light, right? I have a much better understanding of what master means. Because master is vague, right? Like, that's very vague in English. What does that mean, right? Like, okay, you've mastered it. Like, you've climbed to the top of, like, possibility. What are we talking about? Well, we're talking about, I feel confident that we're talking about inner illumination. I feel confident that we're talking about some kind of creation theme, right? Of the light moving in the darkness. But I think also that creation theme, in an abstract way, can also refer to light versus darkness in the sense of good versus evil. Okay? And we see all of that kind of at play here. Because kind of like the thrust of the gospel is that Jesus defeated sin and death by going through sin and death. He wasn't snuffed out by death. God raised him from the grave, from death to life on the third day. So there is something like death is the final enemy. Like Jesus has come to destroy the works of the devil. He has entered the strong man's house. He's entered Satan's house, bound him up, and liberated the captives. So just because we don't have the temptation of Jesus following here doesn't mean that John isn't at all talking about good versus evil. And we're going to see that very much in, like, John 8, where Jesus is like, well, you're from, he's talking to descendants of Abraham. He's talking to Jewish people there in the first century. And he's like, you guys are sons of the devil. You're not, like, he's distancing them from allegiance to God, and actually saying, like, no, actually you're more like the father of lies. And it's like, whoa, that's a very strong claim. What are you talking about? Like, these are your people. Well, as we keep moving through the prologue, we get down to verses 10 through 12, 10 through 13. And it's like, he was in the world, and the world did not know him, right? He came to his own, but his own did not know him. But the ones his own did not receive him. That's what it is. He came to his own, but his own did not receive him. But the ones who did receive him, he gave them the right to be children of God, to be born of God. And then it's like not from the flesh, not from the will of man, but from God. So there's this contrast of he came to his own, he was rejected. Okay, he wasn't understood, he was rejected. But also, like, other parts of New Testament theology are like, well, and the Old Testament as well, but like humans are influenced by the evil forces in rebellion to God. And so like that is at play. So with all of that said, I think there's more than one thing behind the curtain of Heiskatiata Ukatalaban, right? The darkness did not master it, did not snuff out the light, it did not understand the light, and it did not make the light its own. I think there's a little bit of all of those in there. But that's how we go through that process. That's how we look at a word and say, okay, how do I understand this? Now, if you're an English only person and you've been watching and say, that's great, but I can't do all that. Like, I don't know the language. I can't, and understandable, right? You want to pursue the truth to the furthest extent that you have the ability to do so, right? So use the resources that you have, but recognize that while you might be able to look up a word in either your study Bible or maybe you have a Greek lexicon at your disposal, look at the words around your target word. Look at the paragraph. Read the rest of the book. If you're undecided, read the whole book. Read it quickly so that you understand, like, you can see what's repeated. You can see what the themes are. Now come back to your word and say, oh, okay, do I have any more information that kind of helps peg this down, right? So words have a semantic range, which is their possible meaning. And we want to figure out which one of those possible meanings is most appropriate for this context. That is determined by the words around it and the themes of the book that you're in. So if you ever get to the point where you're like, I'm an English only person, I'm overwhelmed, what do? Read the book more. Keep reading the book. Read it quickly to get the repetition. All of those things are really helpful. Then come back and circle around and study again. So that is John 1 through 5. There's a lot of good stuff there. I really enjoy studying God's Word at this depth. God's Word has been so foundational for my faith personally. The more I'm in God's Word, the more I understand who He is. I grow in my intellectual knowledge of Him. That frames my understanding of who He is, my understanding of who I am, and how we're supposed to engage together. That kind of gives me a framework for expecting what my experience is with God and in His creation. And then it also helps me fall in love with Him in a deeper way. And that's what I want for you, the person who follows our ministry. I want you to grow in your intellectual knowledge of God. I want you to have deeper experiences with God. And I want you to increase in your love for God. Because if you do those things, you are going to more faithfully embody the Christian gospel. Your faith and practice are going to grow. And you're going to just be able to love the Lord and love your neighbor as yourself. And so that's really the goal of our ministry, to help you grow in those areas. Stay tuned. My goal is to continue these kind of behind the curtains of seminary type stuff and go in some depth a little bit every week. So stay tuned for the upcoming video. And until then, happy Bibling.